Welcome to unit number 11, the little book of James, the little letter of James. Well, who was James? Who's the author of this letter? Well, it was written by an unknown James. So here are the proposals. James, the son of Zebedee. James, the son of Alphaeus. James, the father of Judas. James, the brother of Jesus. Some would assert that this James teaching is at the heart of the letter, but it was organized and written much later. I think it sounds so much like Jesus. I hold that it's James, the brother of Jesus. But those who would hold that the pseudonymity, that the letter does point to the brother of Jesus, but it was really a later author writing his name. Some would argue that there's no mention of James' relationship to Jesus, so their physical ties were not viewed as important in the early church. That may be one reason he's not mentioned. It would have been more likely that a pseudonymous author would have highlighted the relationship. So that's pretty strong evidence. In other words, if you were pseudonymously writing this letter and assuming James's name, you would think that someone would can highlight and key in on that relationship to the Lord. But that doesn't happen in the letter. The language and the cultural background of the letter are very familiar with Hellenism. The quality of Greek in James is polished, but should not be exaggerated. It's good Greek. It should not underestimate the familiarity of Hellenistic Greek among Palestinian Jews. And yet what's interesting is the word for the church here is synagogue, from which we get our word synagogue, rather than ecclesia. So the Greek word is the assembly that Paul uses, but synagogue. So religious and philosophical concepts would have been much more general than is often supposed. The manner in which the Old Testament in Judaism is treated seems to indicate the letter takes a liberal view of the law, which would go against the traditional view of James's conservatism. So if you wanted to argue that, it is argued by some authors. The tradition is likely exaggerated. So James is indifferent to ritual law, but he doesn't prohibit it. So the relationship between Paul and James is another issue in the book. It's where James says that, this seems to be strongly works-oriented. Now, this is why Luther, in that second chapter, was so against having James in the canon. And he argued vehemently against it because of his strong emphasis upon salvation by grace and grace alone. As you're reading through the letter, you'll see in the second chapter where this comes up. And for example, in 2:18, he says, but someone will say, you have faith and I have works. He says, show me your faith without works, and I'll show you my faith by my works. Okay? And he goes on later to say that we're justified by works. Look in verse 22. Do you see that faith was working together with his works, and by works faith was made perfect? So what's going on here? Well, actually, I don't think James and Paul are in opposition at all. Paul is talking about faith for justification. That is, faith that leads unto salvation. In other words, your faith is how you are justified. James is talking about what happens once you're already a Christian, you're in the faith, then your works show that you are a believer. by what we do. In other words, our lives should be changed. So I think it's just different perspectives on faith. So I see them as back to back, fighting the same battle here. Probably the letter was written before Paul had a chance to visit with James, and maybe that's why he has this little different take on faith here. But again, I think it's his perspective. He's talking about how Christians live. Okay, some would say that it came out of Rome, but more likely it was written actually from Jerusalem. The date, well, those who would opt for pseudonymity would say the end of the first century. Others would say AD 62. And Paul's letters could have been sufficiently widespread. Typical second generation problem of worldliness. It sounds like, well, if you've got the second generation, they're dealing with this thing. But at the end of James' life, or before the Jerusalem Council, this letter could be even mid-40s. Some take it as the earliest letter in the New Testament. And if you take this view, Paul was active in ministry for nearly 15 years by this time. There's no hint of conflict between Jewish and Gentile Christians, and it fits well with the use of Jewish traditions. So, who's he writing to? Jewish Christians, to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations. The 12 tribes need not describe Jewish Christians, nor does diaspora, but the early date and the Jewish character of the letter, probably you've got a more literal meaning here, but it fits James's pastoral concerns. We have pastoral admonition. We have an extensive use of metaphor throughout this letter, and there's use of the Jesus traditions and other Jewish works. The possibilities here is a letter of diatribe where you set up the straw man and you argue against him, like Paul does in Romans. Paranesis, which is instructional writings. Wisdom, certainly it is wisdom. Some would even say wisdom is the chief concept here. And then there's, of course, it has that feel of homily, kind of like a sermon. It was adopted into the canon. It was influenced, the Shepherd of Hermas and First Clement. Clement of Alexandria wrote a commentary on James. Origen cited it as scripture. Eusebius classified it as a disputed book. He may have been alluding to the Syrian church's slowness in accepting all of the Catholic epistles. Again, Catholic means general, because they're not the Catholic epistles. The general epistles are not written to any specific church. It's not found in the Muratorian canon, nor the Mommsen catalog. Clear citations in Hilary of Poitiers and Ambrosiaster. Jerome fully accepted James. Luther accepted its canonicity, but he relegated it to secondary status. And the contribution is we have genuine Christian faith that must be evident in action. I would highlight that one. Double-mindedness is the basic sin that needs to be rooted out of the readers. Discussion of justification that is nuanced differently than Paul's. And he speaks loudly against quietism. In other words, the holding back amongst believers. All right, well, enjoy your reading of this little letter.